Okay, we're going to start chapter 13 today, and it deals with the endocrine system. So the first thing you need to understand is a little bit about what it does. So it helps to control body functions. The last chapter we looked at the nervous system, and the nervous system also helps to control body functions, but because of the way it works through connection through the nerves and neurotransmitters, it brings about a rapid response. So if it's something that has to happen really quickly, then the nervous system is more than likely what is going to control that. The endocrine system provides more of a long-term control. So it's a little slower process. It involves hormones traveling through the blood to get to different areas and basically tell those areas what to do. The two systems work together, really, in order to maintain homeostasis. And because they work so closely together, it's often called the neuroendocrine system. So, the neuroendocrine system. Now, there are two main types of glands. It's important that you understand that so you can understand which ones are involved in the endocrine system and which ones wouldn't be considered endocrine system. We have exocrine glands, so exocrine and endocrine glands. The exocrine glands, a good way to keep them straight is to do compare and contrast. So being glands, they both secrete products. That means they produce them and they release them. But the exocrine glands release their products through a duct, so a tube. So they have a gland and they have a duct that they release their products through. This is their secretion, so the thing that they made, and it would be released through a duct. Now, the place that they're heading to, or their destination, is usually outside of the body or into the digestive tract. Okay, so that tube that goes down through the middle of you is kind of like, it's not really inside of your body cells, it's within a tube that's down the middle of you, and the destination of that stuff is eventually outside the body. So they may secrete their products directly outside, or they may secrete them into the digestive tract, which eventually make their way outside. So some examples would be your sweat glands. Okay, remember learning about the skin and how the sweat glands had a duct, and the duct ended at the sweat pore at your skin surface. So sweat is their secretion, and they release it to outside of your body. Salivary glands would be another example. So when we talk about the digestive tract later on, you'll notice that salivary glands also release saliva through a duct. The pancreas releases enzymes through a duct, and the enzymes and the bicarbonate we're going to learn go down into the digestive tract. So they go into the small intestine and help to break food stuff down. Testes and ovaries also have a duct. So the testes release sperm through a duct, and they will leave the body, and the ovaries release eggs through a duct, and they will either be released out of the body or they may end up forming a baby. Okay? Good morning, Nay. The endocrine glands, on the other hand, they are ductless. So there's no duct or tube that their product goes through. Instead, they release their secretions right into the bloodstream. Okay, so they get picked up and they travel out of the gland via the blood, and they'll travel to other glands or organs. So they stay within the body. Okay, so if you think of it, exocrine, their products are going to exit the body or go into the digestive tract. Endocrine are going to be kept within the body. So they're going to go to other glands or other organs to basically give them directions, tell them what to do. They bring about a response. Okay, so some examples. Well, that's what this whole chapter is about, so you'll learn a lot of examples as we go through. Now there are certain glands that are both exocrine and endocrine. Okay, so they have some products that they release through ducts, and they'll either leave the body or go into the digestive tract. And then they have some that are released into the bloodstream, and their products are hormones. So, there's 3 examples we'll talk about. First is the pancreas. So the pancreas, exocrine, we already mentioned, produces enzymes and bicarbonate ions, and they travel through the pancreatic duct into the digestive tract. In terms of their endocrine products, it releases 2 hormones, insulin and glucagon, which help to regulate blood sugars, releases them right into the bloodstream. The testes, exocrine, or product that leaves the body, is sperm, and they travel through the sperm duct. And the endocrine product is testosterone. So that's the male sex hormone. The ovaries, when you compare them to the testes, the exocrine product is eggs, and then the endocrine product are the hormones estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so those are 3 of the main dual type glands. So they have certain regions of them that are responsible for making exocrine products and certain regions that produce hormones. So it's important for this chapter, since we're dealing with cat's attacking me. Since we're dealing with endocrine glands, it's important that you understand what hormones are, because that is what they produce. Okay, they produce hormones that are released into the bloodstream, and they travel to somewhere, to a certain gland or other organ, in order to tell it to do. Okay, so what are they? They are considered chemical messengers. So they're little molecules that travel. They carry instructions to distant glands or organs. They travel in the bloodstream, we already said. And they cause a response, a biochemical process. That means like reactions to happen in the target tissue. So wherever it's going to tell what to do, it's going to cause reactions to happen inside to bring about the response. Now we can classify hormones as being either target or non-target hormones. So target hormones obviously are going to affect certain specific cells. They have a target. So an example would be gastrin. Gastrin acts only on the gastric glands in the stomach. Okay? A non-target would affect many types of cells. So an example would include insulin. So insulin acts on mostly all cells in order to tell them or get them to make pores so that they can take in glucose. Okay, so they help to regulate blood glucose levels by getting your cells to take in the glucose so they can use it. Another way that we classify hormones is based on their composition and their mode of action. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. Now, the first type is steroid hormones, and the second is non-steroid or protein hormones. I can't write very well with this pen, with the mouse. Protein. There we go. Okay, so non-steroid hormones are very different in their composition than steroid hormones, and so because they are built differently, they work in a different way. And when we talk about non-steroid hormones, we mean either little proteins or just a few amino acids, or even 1 or 2 amino acids big. Okay, so they're considered protein hormones. So this slide kind of does a little compare and contrast between the steroid and non-steroid hormones. They're similar in that they're both hormones, but that doesn't tell me much. So if you just said that on the test, I wouldn't really give you much marks. Okay, so what do hormones do? So you say they're similar in that they carry a message to target cells and cause a response to happen in them. Okay, or they're chemical messengers that are sent in the bloodstream to help direct body functions or something like that. Okay, now how do they differ? So we're going to talk about them a little bit, and then we're going to do some drawings. And you know that I've always said I'm not a very good drawer, so if we take the time to draw something, then it's really important. Okay, so steroid hormones are made from the starting material, cholesterol. So they start with cholesterol, but you can't really say they're made of cholesterol, because that sounds like it's just cholesterol. So cholesterol is what they start with, then a bunch of things will happen to the cholesterol in order to make it the final steroid hormone. So this is what cholesterol looks like. If you remember learning about the different macromolecules, different types, cholesterol belongs to the lipid family, and so it is hydrophobic. Okay, so that means it doesn't like water. Instead, it likes fatty stuff, so it's dissoluble in fat. Okay, so since it can dissolve in fat, we say it's fat soluble. Because it doesn't like water, because it's hydrophobic, it has to have a carrier, protein carrier, in order to carry it through the blood. Because remember, the blood is mostly, like everything else in our body, has a lot of water in it. Okay? But the other important fact about steroid hormone is because it is fat soluble or hydrophobic, it likes the cell membrane and it can pass right through. Okay, so part of its mode of action is based on the fact that it can pass through the cell membrane and go right into the cell. An example is cortisol, and you'll learn some others as we go through the chapter. Okay. Non-steroid hormones, or protein hormones, are composed either of proteins, little peptides, so that's little short chunks of proteins, or individual amino acids, or even just a couple stuck together. They're kind of the opposite. So they are water soluble or hydrophilic, not fat soluble. Okay, not fat soluble. So that kind of gives it the opposite properties. Since it's soluble in the watery blood, there's no need for a protein carrier. Okay? But because it is not soluble in fat, it's not liking the cell membrane, so it cannot enter through the cell membrane. So that means it has to have a different way of working. Okay? An example is adrenaline, or the other name for it is epinephrine. Okay, and we'll look at those in a little more detail as we talk about the types and show. Now, this is pretty complicated looking, and normally I would draw it step by step, okay, but it's kind of hard to do that. It's really hard to do that with the mouse. So what I'm going to try to do is introduce some things slowly. So the first thing that you should draw is a blood vessel. Okay, so there's a blood vessel. Okay, showing with the red lines. And we're going to do the steroid hormone action first. So we're going to do a little symbol for a steroid hormone, so this little triangle, is labeled the steroid hormone. So really important, remember, if you're doing a diagram in biology, that you label everything really clearly. Okay, and this is showing that in order to travel in the blood, the steroid hormone needs to have a protein carrier, because the steroid hormone is fat soluble, it's hydrophobic, and it doesn't like the watery blood. Okay, so it needs to have a protein carrier. When the steroid hormone and its protein carrier reach the target tissue, so this black line is representing the cell membrane of the target tissue. Okay, the steroid hormone can be released from the protein carrier and it can pass through the cell membrane. Okay, because it's hydrophobic and fat soluble, remember the cell membrane is made mostly of phospholipids. Okay, so it can pass through the cell membrane because like dissolves like, if you remember chemistry. Okay, so it passes through the cell membrane, and then because the cytoplasm has a lot of water in it, okay, it's either going to bind to a protein receptor right inside in the cell, in the cytoplasm, or in some cases it travels right into the nucleus and binds in there. So I'll uncover the rest of this here. Just ignore the top part for a little bit. So it binds to the protein receptor, and we call that together a hormone receptor complex. Because here's the hormone and here's the receptor. So we call it a hormone receptor complex. And the hormone receptor complex is going to travel, if it isn't already in the nucleus, the binding doesn't happen in the nucleus, it happens out in the cytoplasm, then it will travel together as a complex into the nucleus. And this is supposed to represent DNA. Okay, so it's the double helix, not a very good drawing, but as I said, I'm not very good at drawing. Okay, it will bind to a certain section on the DNA, to a certain gene, and it will cause the gene to undergo something called transcription. Okay, so the process is called transcription. If you have a scribe for a test, for instance, that means you have someone there to write things down for you. When we say transcribe, it means it's being written in a different way. So the process of transcription takes that gene, or takes that little piece of DNA, a little segment of DNA, and it's going to rewrite it, or molecularly rewrite it. In other words, it's going to allow us to take the DNA and use it to make a little messenger molecule. So the message in the DNA is transcribed or rewritten in a different format, in the messenger molecule called messenger RNA. So the little m is for messenger, and then the big RNA is RNA. So that's transcription. Okay, so down here it's just showing transcription is when DNA is rewritten into a different format called messenger RNA. The messenger RNA is really small. DNA is so big it can't leave the nucleus. So the way that our genetic code is kind of used, how our blueprints in our body is used, is by making little messenger molecules. Now, messenger RNA is small, so it can go out of the nucleus. So it will leave the nucleus, and when it gets out into the nucleus, it's going to cause the production of protein. So in order for the protein to be made, we need the protein factories. So the ribosomes are here. Okay, so the ribosome is going to attach to the messenger RNA. This is little blue strand is still the messenger RNA. And the ribosome can, well, we say read, or it can recognize the message that's in the messenger RNA, and that codes for amino acids in a protein. Remember, proteins are made up of a whole bunch of amino acids. So the messenger RNA says what order they need to go in to make a certain protein. That process is called translation. So translation is when the messenger molecule, messenger RNA, is translated or read and made into the protein. Okay? The protein that's made is what's going to cause the response to happen. So whatever the body is needing to have happen at the time, that is that's what those proteins are going to cause to happen. Okay, so the proteins that are made will elicit the response. Elicit just means to bring about the response. Okay, these other labels are just to help you remember where you are in the cell. Okay, so this is the target cell membrane. This is the nuclear membrane. Remember, it has little pores in it. And then this is inside of the nucleus. Out here, between the cell membrane and the nuclear membrane, would be cytoplasm. So, if you note, transcription happens inside the nucleus, translation happens in the cytoplasm where the ribosomes are. Okay, so it's really important that this little messenger molecule is made so it can go out and cause the proteins to be made that will bring about the response. Okay, so you should have a drawing of this. You should be able to sketch it. This is another drawing that we did a different year. Same kind of thing. I think I might have used different colors in different spots. But this is the slide that explains what we just said. Okay. Hi. No school. Crazy. Janae was a little upset because she wanted to do her science fair, but I'm just doing a video lesson, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to show you. No? I'm going to show you a little video clip. This is just an animation that's showing how the steroid hormone works. Okay, so the S represents the steroid hormone. This would be the carrier protein that's traveling in the blood. Here's the cell membrane of the target cell, and the nucleus, and there's the DNA.
Steroid hormones are not water-soluble. They travel in the blood attached to protein carriers. When steroid hormones arrive at their target cells, they dissociate from their protein carriers and pass through the plasma membrane of the cell. Some steroid hormones bind to specific receptor proteins in the cytoplasm and then move as a hormone receptor complex into the nucleus. Other steroids travel directly into the nucleus before encountering their receptor proteins, not shown. The hormone receptor protein, activated by binding to the hormone, is now able to bind to specific regions of the DNA. These DNA regions are known as the hormone response elements. The binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on the level of transcription at that site. Messenger RNA, mRNA, is produced, which then codes for the synthesis of specific proteins.
And it's those proteins that are made during translation that will bring about the response in the cell. Okay, so that is what happens for a steroid hormone. So if you can remember, steroid hormone is hydrophobic. It is the one that's going to have its action by being able to pass through the cell membrane. Okay, so then you can keep them straight if you had to explain them or do a sketch. Okay, now this one is for the protein hormones. So I'm going to do the same sort of thing. Okay. And I would normally draw it with you, but again, really hard to control with just a mouse. So start off by drawing the blood vessel. Okay, and this time you can draw the protein hormone without a carrier because proteins like water. Okay, so it's hydrophilic and it can pass in the blood without needing a protein carrier. It's the protein itself. The only thing is, because it's not hydrophobic like the steroid hormone, it can't pass through the cell membrane. So instead, this is the cell membrane. The black line again is the cell membrane of the target cell. Okay, so instead, there's a receptor protein that's going to be in the membrane, and the hormone will bind to the receptor protein. And that's going to cause some things to happen in the cell. Okay, so you can pause this at any time to help when you're drawing. This is a little more complicated. If you notice, here's the nuclear membrane down here, and here's the DNA inside the nucleus. The action of the protein hormone all happens in the cytoplasm. Okay, so the hormone and the receptor, they don't move into the cell, and there's no action happening in terms of transcription or translation. It's a different process that happens. I'm just putting the very basics. It's a little more complicated than what we've drawn here. But basically, what happens is when the hormone binds to the protein receptor, it kind of triggers another protein called a G subunit that's sitting in the membrane to be activated, and it will move across until it comes in contact with this enzyme, adenyl cyclase. And some sites call it adenylyl cyclase. Okay, but it is an enzyme that's stuck in the membrane, and it causes a certain reaction to happen. It catalyzes a certain reaction. If you note, it's named cyclase, so it's going to make something cyclic. Okay, so it actually will take ATP that's floating around in the cytoplasm, and it converts it to cyclic AMP. So instead of having 3 phosphates, this molecule will only have 1, and it will be cyclic. So it's made it into, its molecular structure will now be in the form of a cyclic thing. Okay? Cyclic AMP is referred to as a second messenger. So the first messenger was the hormone. The second messenger is a messenger that causes things to happen inside of the cell. So it causes a series of reactions to happen. So we call it a cascade of reactions. So a whole bunch of steps, a whole bunch of reactions happen inside the cytoplasm because there's certain enzymes that are activated and they'll act on other molecules. And those steps are what bring about the desired response. Okay, so you can rewind it and play it again whenever you see fit, but basically, protein hormone, it doesn't require the carrier protein because it is a protein itself and likes water and it's in the blood. But when it gets to the membrane, it can't pass through, so it has to bind to a receptor that's in the membrane. When it binds, this G subunit kind of gets triggered to move across in the membrane, and it will activate an enzyme called adenyl or adenylyl cyclase, which causes ATP to be converted to cyclic AMP, the secondary messenger. That molecule starts a cascade of reactions. So it kind of triggers a series of reactions to happen that brings about the desired response. So we're going to watch a little animation of that. And the different reactions are different depending on what the target cell is what enzymes are
Epinephrine
there.
is one of many hormones that is water-soluble, hydrophilic, and therefore unable to cross the hydrophobic plasma membranes of its target cells. Instead, it binds to receptor proteins located in the plasma membrane and does not enter the cell. When epinephrine binds to beta-adrenergic receptors on the liver cell, G proteins on the inner side of the cell membrane are activated. Each G protein is composed of 3 subunits, and the binding of epinephrine to its receptor protein causes one of the G protein subunits to dissociate from the other 2. The G protein subunit which dissociates from the others carries a GDP, which is replaced by GTP when the subunit is activated. The activated G protein subunit then diffuses within the plasma membrane until it encounters adenylyl cyclase, a membrane enzyme that is inactive until it interacts with the G protein subunit. When activated by the G protein subunit, adenylyl cyclase catalyzes the formation of cAMP from ATP. The cAMP formed at the inner surface of the membrane diffuses within the cytoplasm, where it binds to and activates protein kinase A, an enzyme that adds phosphate groups to specific cellular proteins. In liver cells, protein kinase A phosphorylates and thereby activates another enzyme called phosphorylase, which converts glycogen into glucose 6-phosphate. The glucose 6-phosphate is then converted to glucose. Through this multi-step mechanism, epinephrine causes the liver to secrete glucose into the blood during the fight or flight reaction.
Okay, so it talks in more detail about what happens with the G subunit, how it gets activated and dissociates. That is 3 parts. We simplify it by showing that the one ends up being activated and moves across in the cell membrane till it encounters the enzyme adenylyl cyclase or adenylyl cyclase, and that causes ATP to be converted to cyclic AMP. The cyclic AMP triggered all those steps to happen to get the end result. Okay, so in this case, the end result was for the liver cell to break down glycogen and release the glucose into the bloodstream during the fight or flight response. So that is the non-steroid or protein hormone action. That's just another diagram of it. Okay, and another diagram of it. But there's a slide that goes along with it as well that explains the steps that we just talked about. And this is a picture from your book. Okay, so you should be able to sketch and describe what happens, their mode of action. Oh, look, I have like so many of them. Now, this slide highlights different endocrine glands that we have and the main ones that we'll be focusing on. Okay, so there's the pituitary gland, thyroid gland, parathyroid gland, the pancreas, certain cells in the pancreas called the islets of Langerhans, the pineal gland, which is, well, I'm not going to tell you because you're going to learn where these all are and what they produce and what their actions are. The thymus gland, the adrenal gland, the gonads, and the gonads, I don't know if we've talked about this much or not, but the gonads, that's just a term for reproductive organs. So it would be the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female. And then the digestive organs, because some of them will secrete hormones as well. The pituitary gland, remember from last chapter, we talked about the pituitary gland and how it is known as the master gland because it controls a lot of the actions of other glands in the body, other endocrine glands. So if you remember when we learned about the brain, this part right here is the hypothalamus, and right below it is the pituitary gland. Okay, so the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that kind of regulates the pituitary gland. So it's attached by a little stalk, and there's two lobes. There's the front lobe, which is closer to your nose, that's the anterior lobe, and then there's the back lobe, or posterior lobe, which is closer to the back of your head. Now, the anterior lobe produces its own hormones, where the posterior lobe is kind of a storage spot that stores hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. How it's controlled, like most other processes we've talked about, the production of hormones is controlled usually through negative feedback loops. Hormones or releasing factors and nerve impulses control the release from the pituitary gland, and then the levels of the end hormones will kind of regulate when those earlier steps will stop or when they need to happen. So because it controls so many of the other endocrine glands, its nickname is the master gland. I think that will be it for this video lesson. Well, I suppose I could show, we've looked at more steps in the negative feedback loop. In this particular chapter, we'll focus more on the steps from the integrator. So the integrator would be the part of the brain, so the hypothalamus, to its effector, which is usually the pituitary gland. Okay, and then the pituitary gland will release hormones that have an action on a certain other gland or other tissues, and then their response, which is usually to release another hormone or whatever. Okay, so normally high levels of whatever this end product is will inhibit the earlier steps. So it inhibits the release of more of it. And so we usually, as we've done before, we indicate it with the dashed arrows and the negative signs. Okay, so this example, the hypothalamus releases a releasing hormone that tells the pituitary gland to release LH, and LH is luteinizing hormone. The RH that they're talking about here is releasing hormone. Okay, so when the pituitary gland releases LH, or luteinizing hormone, which we'll learn in a little bit, it travels to the testes and causes the testes to release testosterone. So when testosterone levels are in the proper range, don't want them to get too high. So when they start to be in the proper range, then it'll send a message. Because it's in the proper range, it'll be detected, and the earlier steps will be turned off so that not too much is made. Okay, so through the chapter we're going to look at a few other hormones that have similar negative feedback loop, and you would just be expected to do a little negative feedback loop like this for one of them. The pituitary gland, is said, produces its own hormones from the anterior lobe, and then in the posterior lobe it stores certain hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. Okay, so the anterior lobe produces these 6 hormones that you'll be responsible for. So through the chapter, through the next activities, you can learn what they do. Maybe they act on another gland and they cause it to produce something, which in turn will cause other tissues to do other things. So we're going to learn about what each of them does and how they're regulated, and some disorders that are caused when they're not in proper levels. So we have growth hormone, or somatotropin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenal corticotropin hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. Okay, so when you're trying to keep them straight, if you have little concept maps, that means just pictures and words and arrows, then that will help you to keep them straight so you're not having to look at a whole lot of words all the time, but it just simplifies it a lot more. So here, for instance, it shows the anterior lobe and the production of prolactin. It affects the breast tissue, so it's got a picture of a breast. It doesn't keep going and talk about the next steps, what it causes to happen, but it's a start. Okay, so it's just showing with pictures the different tissues that the hormones will act on. Okay, the posterior lobe, it produces ADH, and if you remember from 2 chapters ago, chapter 11, when we talked about excretion, ADH travels to the kidneys and causes it to reabsorb more water. It also produces oxytocin, and oxytocin is really important during pregnancy and childbirth. So it's showing a picture of the uterus here because it causes contractions in the uterus. That's one of the things that it does. We'll learn more as we go through. Here's another picture. I think this one's the one from your book. Okay, so it shows using pictures. It's got it backwards this way. So this is the anterior lobe and this is the posterior lobe. It shows how the hypothalamus has nerve endings that go down into the posterior lobe and it produces hormones that are stored there. It also has nerve endings that go into the anterior lobe, but that's more for control. So it releasing hormones that cause the pituitary to release its products. Okay, it shows again with pictures what the different hormones are going to go and act on. Okay, so these are the tissues that they'll act on, but it doesn't talk about what each one does yet. So, in this chapter, specifically, you're going to be making big concept map. Okay, so these are just quick ideas, but you're going to make a big one, and this is only for the pituitary gland. Okay, and it should show the regions of the gland, what hormone they produce. So the hormones are listed in red. They're going to go and act on certain tissues. So here's the target tissue in white, and then the purple is what it causes to happen. Okay. This particular one is saved on the website, so you can have a look at it as we're going through learning about the different hormones that are produced by the pituitary gland or produced by the hypothalamus and stored in the pituitary gland. But there's all those other endocrine glands that we're also going to learn about too. So by the end of this chapter, you should have a big concept map or a big study tool of some sort that helps you keep track of all the hormones that are released by all the different glands in the endocrine system, what target tissues they act on, and what response they cause. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to do that. Hopefully we're in class tomorrow, but that is a start for chapter 13.